Waffles House, who'd been Ronald Reagan's chief of the Environmental Protection Administration. And they produced a remarkable report. And when I agreed to give this talk, I got it down and read it again, and it's really quite extraordinary. If you change a few dates, you can read it right now as a description of the world's environmental situation, and it's not very cheerful. I'll just give you one example. Last fall, Jim McNeil, who's still alive and who was then the chairman of my institute's board, gave a talk at the University of Ottawa in which he spoke of the import of the Brundtland report. Since he wrote it, I'll let him summarize it. Quote, 20 years ago in Chapter 1, we described a world threatened by interlocking crises. We spoke of rising levels of population and a spiraling growth of megacities in the Third World, along with major projected increases in consumption in the developed world, of increasing levels of poverty and inequity within and between nations, of continuing huge transfers of wealth from the poor to the rich, built into grossly inequitable trading relations, of unsustainable increases in the consumption of our natural capital, our soils, waters, and forests, of the destruction of species, and of the growing menace of climate change. We pointed out that these environmental syndromes presented, quote, a threat to national security and even survival, unquote, greater than any military threats then on the horizon. Doesn't that sound familiar? We pointed out that, quote, again from the Brundtland report, most efforts to maintain human progress, to meet human needs, and to realize human ambitions are simply unsustainable in both rich and poor nations. One final quote I find equally germane 20 years later, we act as we do because we can get away with it. Future generations do not vote. They have no political or financial power. They cannot challenge our decisions, and we are rapidly closing the options for future generations. Now, this is pretty powerful stuff, and this is 21 years ago that it was published. It attracted an enormous amount of media attention, not least because not only was the report tough, but the commissioners all signed it. They had a unanimous agreement, which in itself was really quite extraordinary. Morris Strong, who reappears yet again, used the oxygen created by the Commission to energize the preparations for a huge conference in 1992 in Rio de Janeiro. Since the Stockholm Conference in 1972, of which Morris was also the Secretary General, he pops up in all these stories, the UN had organized a whole bunch. They'd ruined the franchise. They'd organized a whole bunch of these two-week conferences on every subject. Most of them nobody paid any attention to. So Morris decided to up the ante. He egged on those negotiating the climate change and biodiversity treaties to get the things finished so they could be signed in Rio. But then he upped it again by turning it into a summit. Now, everybody has summits these days. In those days, summits were fairly rare. They were reserved for Sir Edmund Hillary and the G7. But basically, he concluded that having a meeting of environment ministers, who are usually political pipsqueaks, I hope there are no former environment ministers here, would not solve the problem. You needed heads of state. And so they got 102 heads of state to come together. And this reflected, as I say, one of the principal learnings of the Brundtland Commission, which is that sustainable development won't work in large organizations unless the person on the top is prepared to make a serious, personal, long-term political and personal commitment to making it happen. Just as Ed Woolard of DuPont once described the term CEO as Chief Environmental Officer, now the Ministers of Finance would become Ministers of Finance and Sustainable Development. And this would be legitimized in Rio by a massive roundtable of some 120 heads of state in Rio who would be asked to sign a ringing delegation. Now, I got sent there, as somebody mentioned, as a journalist to write what was supposed to be a pithy political column for the handout newspaper that was produced there. And Morris gave us an office in the Secretariat building. And this was where they decided to build this table that would hold these 120 people. And the Brazilian army came through and cleared the whole place out before the meeting, but they forgot about us, and we were up in the little office up on the top, scribbling away and writing our stories. And about, I guess 1 o'clock, noon, as the thing was starting, I suddenly realized I had about 8 cups of coffee, and the consequences of that were starting to set in. And the only place where you could actually use a toilet was adjacent to where this meeting was being held. So I wandered down, and it was a classic because it was right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, so there were at least 25 or 30 new countries. You couldn't exactly put name tags on saying, hello, my name is Brian Mulroney, I'm the Prime Minister of Canada. So most of these people didn't know each other. I walked into the room by mistake, and I had done some work for the government of Jamaica. And P.J. Patterson, who was the Prime Minister, fastened on me as a face he knew. He had no idea who I was, but at least he recognized who I was, took me over and introduced me to George H.W. Bush, who was the only other person he knew, who was then the President of the United States. So the security didn't work terribly well. And I'm not sure the meeting held together terribly well since nobody knew who anybody else was, but they did sign a declaration. They all got their pictures taken like a high school football team on a bunch of risers smiling sweetly. And Canada actually played a major role in the conference. Maurice Strong was the star of the show. Brian Mulroney saved the Biodiversity Convention from destruction at the hands of the semi-articulate U.S. Vice President Dan Quayle. For those of you old enough, that was the potato man. This encouraged the Europeans to sign on because if the great Irish tenor who joined Ronald Reagan in singing When Irish Eyes Are Smiling could stand up to President Bush, so could they. So the Biodiversity Convention went through. The delegation was led by the Environment Minister Jean Charest, who had a wonderful time. He had a better time there than he's ever had as Premier of Quebec, I can guarantee you. And we all had a good time. The conference came to an end, and we came back home. Well, these things come round again, and in 2001, I was asked to chair a panel to prepare the Canadian National Report for the World Summit on Sustainable Development, another one of these bloody things, in Johannesburg. I won't go into the story of how the report was killed off by the Prime Minister's office because they began by saying we need an independent assessment of Canada's progress, and that's what they got, and they decided that's not actually what they wanted. They wanted a bureaucrat to say we had made some progress. But we found that there had been some real progress. The Commissioner for Environment and Sustainable Development had been set up in the Auditor General's office. An ill-prepared delegation had gone to Kyoto and negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. And the story behind that is a fascinating one because no one had focused on the Kyoto negotiations at all until Jean Chrétien visited Europe and was mugged by Tony Blair and Helmut Kohl, who was the German Chancellor, and said, there's going to be this conference on climate change. What are you going to do? And Chrétien phoned the Prime Minister's office back in Ottawa and said, I don't know much about this, but we have to do better than the Americans. That was the instruction to the Canadian delegation that negotiated the Kyoto Protocol. Canada had taken the lead on a number of international conventions on persistent organic pollutants and others, and there are many companies in Canada that have begun to shift their attention back to the development of corporate environmental policies, which went beyond mere compliance with environmental rules. But compared with the scale of the challenges identified by the Brundtland report, we really hadn't done very much. And in fact, we'd gone from the top of the table in the OECD to down near the bottom. So we'd actually gone backwards. Sustainable development, once one of our very strong points, had taken root in Europe, Japan, and several other countries, and these countries had made real progress on integrating the environment and economics in their budgets and their national decision-making process and others. Perhaps most notably, sustainable development had been embedded into the Treaty of Amsterdam by one of my colleagues at ISD, which is the EU's basic constitution. So one of the purposes of the European Union is to pursue sustainable development, which is actually a justiciable part of the European Constitution. So the Commission can and has been taken to court on a number of occasions because it has done things which clearly weren't in pursuit of sustainable development. So the Europeans raced ahead and we were stuck in the mud. Now what happened? Another history lesson? I think we've all got theories. My theory goes like this. First, we had the inevitable constitutional crisis. Some of you may remember the ill-fated Charlottetown Accord. The politicians who were having such a good time in Rio came back home and had to put up with the cross-country consultations on the Charlottetown Accord and its eventual failure to pass. The government then fell later that year, eco